wanted to just touch quickly on what you mentioned earlier when you said about generational curses,
Mhm.
because you mentioned them. So, I was not assume, but so you believe in this expression. And this is one of the teachings that is kind of controversial in the church
Mhm.
because there's so many different views there. So please bear with me until I read something because there are two different views and I want to touch on some Bible verses when it comes to both views, and then we can conclude. When it comes to the first part that may seemingly um, teach this doctrine of, well, not doctrine, but may support generational curse, um, it is true that God said He would punish children for the sin of idolatry their fathers committed. And we read this in Exodus 25, 34:7, Numbers 14:18, and Deuteronomy 5:9. Actually, I can read one of them right now. It says, for example, in Exodus 25, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, meaning to these idols and gods. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me. Okay. Now I want to read also some explanation and commentary. It is rather a collective punishment on the nation, not as a personal curse on individual family that God would curse. Second thing, according to Jewish Targum, and for the audience, I want to just explain what the Jewish Targum was. It was an Aramaic paraphrase or interpretation of the Hebrew text of the Jewish scriptures, meaning the Old Testament, provided by the rabbis. And according to these Jewish Targums, this passage or passages which I just mentioned in the Old Testament refer to ungodly fathers and rebellious children who would continue in the sins of their fathers. So it's not like uh, basically the commentary what they're saying, and I think I agree with them that we cannot assume that for every sin that we commit, let's say that we are wicked, that well at least that I'm wicked. Let's say I commit any sin, the Old Testament, at least these few verses, passages which I mentioned, they're not teaching that for anything God will punish our kids. So in that regard, there is generational curse, but rather, especially in the case of the ancient Israel, because of their sin of idolatry, if their children continue, that God will keep punishing them. So I just want to ask you briefly, do you agree with this conclusion with this Bible commentary?
I mean, basically, I think the passage you read is the Ten Commandments, and that's part of the covenant between Israel and God. And he's like, look, if you commit adultery, yeah, your kids are going to pay for it. Doesn't mean that. So like when we hear curse, we think something, but I think what it means is, yeah, you're going to pay the consequences. Like for instance, if you sin, then you're going to be in exile, and your poor kids are the ones that are going to suffer it because you're going to get killed by the Babylonians, but your kids are going to be enslaved by the Babylonians. So yeah. I mean, are the kids cursed? I mean, that's one way of thinking about it, but I don't think when I talk about generational curses, it's not God doing the cursing. so so then there's the passage in Ezekiel, which God says, "Oh no, you're not guilty. Like you don't have your parents' guilt, and yet you may have consequences for your parents' sin." And so, like, okay, I have a young friend whose dad committed a sin and a crime and was thrown in jail, screwed up the kid's life. Is the kid cursed by God, or those are just consequences for bad behavior? Um, by the way, they both ended up getting baptized, so things are better. But that's how God can restore. Like, yes, there's still human. Sometimes there's consequences that you can't overcome. But when I talk about generational curses, I'm usually talking about spiritual powers. I'm usually talking about a human who makes a deal with the spiritual power and says, "Power, you give me and my family wealth and authority, and we will serve you. And if we don't serve you, you can rain destruction on my ancestors and me, for that matter." And a couple generations go by, the family stops following the power. Power's like, "Okay, hey, we have authority." Like, my theology doesn't accept that, by the way. My theology says once you're in Christ, all that stuff's broken. But my experience has been ministering to people. Sometimes people still have to deal with these curses that their parents made, or their grandparents, or their great great grandparents. Sometimes are these really they're oaths, right? An oath that somebody made to some spiritual power. And so sometimes in ministry and deliverance, the deliverance word, I don't overread what I just said about deliverance. But like sometimes in like helping people experience freedom from spiritual stuff, it's dealing with an oath that an ancestor did to some power, and even though they may be in Christ, the power still for some reason has authority. So you just bring it under the blood, under the Lord, and you break the oath, and it's done. I think in a way, like you can see that with Daniel. Now I brought this up with Dr. Heiser, and he didn't agree, so I'll probably go with Dr. Heiser on this. But let me just tell you the conversation, right? Heiser didn't see it, but so like Daniel at one point, so Daniel's in Babylon. They're experiencing the curse of idolatry, and Daniel apologized for the sins of his fathers, and then he apologized for it. Did that undo the sin? Mike didn't think so, and so I'll probably go with that. But it's interesting. I shouldn't say but. And it's interesting that an angel did come with a prophetic word in response to that prayer. So did Daniel, was he able to intercede on this? No, Jesus was. Jesus able to intercede. Here I am. I'm working out theology in my head, guys. This is how it works, right? We ask questions, and we argue. And I had this brilliant idea. Mike's like, "Yeah, no." I'm like, "Well, but no, but Jesus did it though." I'm like, "Oh yeah, Jesus is our model, not Daniel." So it's just how theology works. So Jesus dealt with the curses and the oaths. If you find yourself afflicted and you understand that, like you learn or it comes out that an ancestor has an oath to a spiritual power, man, bring that to the Father. Let him deal with it. Break it and experience freedom.
Yeah, you already answered what I was about to say, because I was just about to mention Ezekiel 18:20 and the other passage, the other view, which will be like, no, God will not punish the sins of the fathers, to their children. And then, of course, my next point will be like, well, what about if Satan or these demonic powers and entities, if they want to curse someone? That was my last point or question, but you already answered. So uh, God will not curse people and their children, especially not to the fourth generation, if we understand the context. So it's usually the demonic powers that they bring curses. So my question is, when it comes to these curses, they're usually understood and misunderstood in so many different ways. Can we say that not everything bad happening in someone's house or in someone's life is a curse? Because sometimes it's a bad habit. If I drink, it doesn't have to be because my father was drinking. If I'm using drugs, it doesn't have to be because my dad used drugs. It could be because I had a bad parent or bad friends around me. I wasn't growing up in a healthy community or surrounding family. Maybe I got bad cousins or again friends in school, whatever. But what about when it comes to some not just addictions, which I just mentioned, or bad habits? What about when it comes to cancer, which you mentioned already, or some other diseases that kill people, or maybe criminal activity that is so very often portrayed in some families, so others would say, "Wow, that family seems like cursed." Could it be that there's something, like you said, because of something in the past? Could it be that there is something in the blood or something that is unwillingly, somehow, we don't know how, spiritually passed from parents to children, even though the children do not know this, and it's not their fault, but because of that spiritual entity who hates, because we know the enemy hates people, period.
Mhm.
They don't need some special reason or argument to hate people. But could it be that there's something in the blood or something spiritual that is passed through the seed on generations, where like you can see like wow, this person is so cursed, they're not just mimicking their father, but they're even worse in their sin. Can we make a conclusion like this, that then in that case it can be a generational curse?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And yeah, something came to mind when you were talking is like epigenetics, where people genetically pass on traits and actually memories to their descendants. And sometimes um, we probably don't want to go down that rabbit trail today because we've been talking for a couple hours, and but epigenetics, people will say, well, it's in my genetics. I'm an alcoholic because it's in my genes, or my dad and my granddad and my great granddad were all you know adulterers, committed adultery, so it's just part of my blood. Jesus can heal that, and he does. I mean, Jesus can break that. He can heal you. Some people, it's sanctification. It's this process of working out our salvation. Other people, it's broken. The addiction is just broken. The behavior is just broken, and like God can don't. You're not a slave to your genetics. Like your genetics are a gift. And so if you have like broken parts of your genetic structure that leads to different negative behaviors or inability to perform how you want, God can redeem that. He does. He does redeem it. So I mean, the blood, like you're not a slave to your parents' blood. You're a slave to Jesus's blood.